Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James, and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. And today I am bringing you another episode of Quick Album Reviews. As always with this series, I am going to talk about my thoughts very quickly on many different albums that I have heard over the past month or so, and I always try to keep it as recent as I can, although there may be albums that are slightly less recent than others. And there also may be albums that I have a little more to say about than others, and if that is the case, I will say more, but still not try to make the video go on for ages on end. So, without further ado, I do have 7 different albums on the docket to talk about, so let's get started with the first album I'm going to be discussing. And first on the list is Chromakopia by Tyler, the Creator. I think I would have to say that I find Tyler, the Creator, to be one of the most interesting rappers working right now. I'll admit it did take me a bit of time to grow on him, and there are definitely certain albums of his that I need to revisit. In particular, Igor, which was an album that I didn't necessarily love when I first heard it, but as I've returned to specific songs from that album, I found myself enjoying it more. And I did genuinely enjoy Call Me If You Get Lost, but that is still another one that I think I would like to explore even more to really appreciate it. But with Chromakopia, it sees Tyler doing what he does best, which is essentially pushing his boundaries and trying new things and seeing how they work for his style. And I think that he does that very well on this album and delivers what could very well be my favorite album of his at this point. I just absolutely love what this album does. It is easily one of my favorite albums of the year right now. I think it shows Tyler at his most vulnerable and also in places at his most vicious. I think Saint Chroma does a great job of beginning off the album and getting you into the vibe of what the album is going to offer. This one is very psychedelic and has some rock elements in it as well that I really appreciate, and I think it really shows Tyler delving into the fact that many times he feels like he has to wear a mask and become a different version of himself when he's on stage and even when he's just surrounded by other people. And this is just to hide the insecurities that he has. There are also so many bangers on this album. Ratata is a pure flex track that I can't help but love, and the song Thought I Was Dead is just excellent, easily one of my favorites on the album, where Tyler talks about the fact that if people thought he couldn't produce songs like this anymore because of his change in style, then they were dead wrong. And he also talks about how he has changed and become a better person on this album, and critiques those who think that he is still the same person that he was earlier in his career when he was admittedly a bit more of a controversial figure. But there are some songs where he strips back the layers too and shows quite a bit of vulnerability. Even on a banger song like Noid, he still talks about his frustration with the fact that he has to deal with this feeling of people constantly watching him because of his celebrity status, and that he just sometimes wants them to leave him alone. Or on what is probably the best song on the album, Take Your Mask Off, where Tyler shows a lot of empathy and goes into the perspectives of many different people and talks about how all of them are living different lives of struggle because they aren't really able to be who they truly want to be. And then in the final verse, revealing that he himself can sort of relate to each of these other perspectives that he goes into in the first 3 verses. It's a frank, honest song that I really appreciated, and the beautiful jazzy instrumentation in the song only serves to add to that, along with a gorgeous vocal performance from Daniel Caesar. There's just so many great moments on this album that I could further mention, like the song Sticky, which has great verses from all its features, even though I wish they would have been a little longer, or the powerfully subtle ending that is I Hope You Find Your Way Home, which feels like a direct callback to Call Me If You Get Lost, except going the opposite way, now hoping that the person won't get lost and that they will get back to where they need to be. I just simply think this is a great album, and if you listen to it, I think it is pretty easy to see why. In some ways, this is Tyler's most accessible album that he's made in a while, but in others, it is his most experimental, and I appreciate those two dichotomies coming together in a really great way. Strong 4 out of 5 stars on this one. Next up is the self-titled album from Make Them Suffer, and I'll admit, in some ways in the past, I've not really seen the hype of this band. I know a lot of people really liked their previous album, How to Survive a Funeral, and while I think that album is fine, it didn't particularly wow me. But I will admit I started to get the hype of this band when I heard singles that were promoting this album, such as Ghost of Me and Doom Switch, which showed some really impressive incorporation of synth and electronic work into their metalcore sound that I think worked very well for them. Especially on Ghost of Me, where the two lead vocalists traded off in a way that was very impressive. And overall, I think what we get out of this album is a pretty solid metalcore release. It's not necessarily anything that's going to blow your mind or anything like that, but I do think it has a very distinct style that makes me like it a little bit better than How to Survive a Funeral. I think it's pretty fun throughout, and it is definitely a mainstream metalcore album to the core, usually for better, although sometimes a bit for worse. There are some really fun moments on the song, such as the heavy hitter Mana God that exerts some of the older deathcore influences that Make Them Suffer had, or the closing track, Small Town Syndrome, which is just so much fun and does bring back the sound that they had on How to Survive a Funeral, which for people who like this album, liked that album rather, they will probably really enjoy this song. There aren't really that many moments that I can say I outright dislike on this album. I suppose that Oscillator is a little bit cliched. It sort of reminds me of Wage War, and it feels very standard in terms of how a metalcore song is supposed to go, but then there are some admittedly unique tracks like Venusian Blues or Tether that are pretty cool sounding. So overall, I did enjoy this album. I don't have a whole lot to say on it because what you see is what you get on this album essentially, and sometimes that works well enough for an album like this. Solid 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. And next up is the album The Great Impersonator by Halsey. And man, I've always feel like I've had a very contentious relationship with this artist. I've been revisiting their albums this year, and if anything, their earlier releases don't really hold up for me at all. Not that I was really big fans of them in the first place, but I like them even less now. I think Badlands was very much a product of its time, and while it definitely had influence in the time it was out, a lot of it does feel very outdated and cheesy to me, and Hopeless Fountain Kingdom just felt like a tired retread of Romeo and Juliet, and it didn't really add anything to make the story feel any more interesting or fresh for the new age, and a lot of the songs on that one just simply do not stick out to me at all. I do still enjoy the album Manic overall and think it's a better version of the pop sound she was going for on her earlier releases. And the album If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power, which was produced by Nine Inch Nails fame Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, is still definitely Halsey's best. Now, I will say The Great Impersonator had interesting build-up leading to it, with the fact that Halsey was going to be taking influence from all these iconic artists ranging from Kate Bush to Amy Lee of Evanescence, but it was also leading to a concept that was sort of sad to read about, as Halsey had found out that she was diagnosed with cancer and she wasn't sure if she was going to live anymore, and so she sort of became a shell of herself and didn't even want to be herself anymore, so she wanted to be other people. And I think what we got out of it was a very raw and honest album that, while maybe not as good as Halsey's previous album, is still pretty good in its own right. I did really enjoy this release. I found it to be a pretty tough one to get through because of its raw vulnerability. It does make it a bit of a tough listen, and there are definitely parts where Halsey can come across maybe a little bit self-absorbed and unlikable, but at the same time, I can't really blame her considering what she was going through. For example, on the song Lonely as a Muse, I think some people might find themselves rolling their eyes at this one because she compares herself to a martyr and even goes so far as to compare herself to Jesus. But the point of the song is to not call herself a Christ-like figure. I think it's to actually strip down the illusion of the concept of the artist and the fact that she is there for people when they want her to be there, but as soon as they don't need her, then she doesn't exist to them anymore. So she's more of a concept than she is a person, which makes her a muse, a lonely muse at that. And I like that the sound of this song adds to that melodramatic feeling. This one is inspired by Evanescence, and I think the rock capabilities of the song is just really well done. I think Halsey makes maybe her best song to date here. I think this song has so much conviction to it, and even if the lyrics can be a little controversial in places, I think they do work in terms of the message that she's delivering here. That also goes for a song like Ego or the very raw Life of the Spider, which is just a draft, and you can sort of understand why she didn't really push the song any further, because it is not an easy listen. Definitely one of the saddest songs of the album. And yeah, I also really do enjoy the song Lucky, where she is interpolating the chorus from Britney Spears' own song of the same name, and while the song isn't as good as Britney Spears, it is interesting to see Halsey sort of seeing herself in Britney, and there are definitely some moments on this album where it feels a little samey, which is a little disappointing considering the fact that Halsey claimed to be influenced by so many different artists, but there are a couple of here where I didn't really see the influence besides on a very thin level. The song Dog Years in particular didn't really work for me with the lyrics and came across a little obnoxious, even though I got the point of what she was saying. But I still did think this was a good album, and I do think that it showed Halsey really just laying it all out there, and I really do respect her for that. 3.5 out of 5 stars for this one. Man, I know I've said in the past that I don't want to talk about Skillet anymore, but like a toxic relationship, I just can't seem to get away from them. I am always holding out this small modicum of hope that they can come back to being the band that I once knew them to be, even if they have let me down time and time again for many, many, many years now. But this year, this is probably the closest to optimistic that I've gotten, even coming off of an album that I felt like was their worst to date. Hearing them that they were going to go independent did inspire a little bit of hope in me that maybe they had some new vitality in them, that maybe they were going to be pursuing music that they loved making again, that they genuinely wanted to make. And I'll admit, in some ways that actually happened, which was sort of a pleasant surprise for me. But there is still some issues with this album for sure. It still is not perfect by any means, and unfortunately it still shows them having some of the same problems that they've always had post-Comatose, in my opinion. But I am going to give Skillet credit for actually trying for the first time in a long time on more than just a couple of songs. I think this album gets off to a good start with the song Showtime, for an example. This one is definitely reminiscent of a song like Feel Invincible, which is a song I do like for as generic as it is, but I think this one is actually a little bit more fun than that song. Not Afraid brings in some cool nu metal influences to Skillet that we haven't really seen before, and John Cooper sort of rap singing actually works on this song. It actually brings about a sense of fun that I enjoyed. And then, man, Ash in the Wind, I would have never expected that Skillet would have the capability to make a song like this again. This is the first time in a long time that I think Skillet has the potential to make my top 50 best songs of the year, because this song genuinely gives me Comatose vibes. I absolutely love this track. I think John Cooper sounds so confident on here, especially in the very explosive chorus, and the beautiful atmospheric ending with Jen Ledger is great. I also love that it sees the band being more vulnerable and showing their flaws. And the follow-up song, Fire Inside of Me, has similar subject matter, but it's also great. And I love that it is more of a symphonic metal song. It brings back the strings, and it feels, once again, sort of like seminally Skillet. even the ballad on here actually works sort of well. Happy Wedding Day, describing John Cooper's daughter getting married. And it's actually a genuinely sweet song. And I like that it delves into more personal stuff within John's own life. Something that we haven't really seen since Comatose, I would say. But still, in the midst of that, there are ways that this album frustrates me. Unpopular was a terrible lead single. It was a terrible way to begin off this album. And it showed the more unlikable side of John Cooper that has unfortunately been seeping into his music lately. And this song seems like an attack back at the critics, saying that he doesn't care if they think he's unpopular, but yet he's still making a song about it, so there is a part of him that cares, in my opinion. It always makes my eyes roll right up to the ceiling when artists make songs like this. And then we've got what is, oh my goodness, easily one of Skillet's worst songs in All That Matters. I hate the stomp clap beat of this song. It is terrible. And whenever Skillet brings country influences into their songs, like they did on American Noise and Rise a couple years back, it never works in their favor. They're also just spouting off the most cliched conservative talking points. I also find Revolution to be pretty cheesy, and the closing song, Death to Fire, while musically pretty fun, is lyrically not very well written at all. And yeah, it leads to an album that is definitely Skillet's best in a long time, but still having plenty of problems with it. But it does leave me more hopeful for this band's future than I have been in a long time. If they go down the route of songs like Ash in the Wind or Fire Inside of Me for the future, I think we could get another good album out of this band. I'm really hopeful for that. 2.5 out of 5 stars for this one though, but probably one of the more optimistic 2.5 out of 5s I've given this year. Next up is the album From Zero by Linkin Park. Yeah, Linkin Park came back this year. They've been sort of building up their return for a while, I feel like. And I'll admit I was a little bit hesitant about this album. I was even hesitant about listening to it because especially of the controversy surrounding the new vocalist Emily Armstrong. It just surprised me that Linkin Park would go out of their way to choose her as their vocalist. And when I say Linkin Park, I think I can more specifically point to Mike Shinoda because it's clear that he has pretty big creative control in the band. So the fact that he didn't really vet her before choosing her for the vocalist is a little perplexing to me. If you don't know, Emily Armstrong is a Scientologist, and she seemed to be a supporter of the proven criminal Danny Masterson. And yeah, that did admittedly leave a very bad taste in my mouth, although she did respond afterwards saying that she didn't really support Danny Masterson, although there was no part of her statement that disavowed Scientology in the process. I still couldn't help myself but be curious about this album and what it was going to offer, so I did delve into it. And what I got, I think, was actually a pretty alright album. It still feels like a bit of a pale imitation of Linkin Park, though, I have to say. I think the biggest problem here is that the band doesn't really push their sound forward and evolve. Instead, they're going back to nostalgic sounds from their older albums and using that to remind you of what the band was when Chester Bennington was in the band. And I think that was maybe the worst choice they could have possibly made in some ways, because when Chester was part of the band always moved forward. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. The main point I'm making is that Linkin Park always moved forward. They didn't go back to old stuff just for nostalgia's sake. And that's what they're doing here, which makes them feel more like a legacy band, which I'm not sure that I really like. There are still some good moments on here that I did enjoy, but I think that might more be because they remind me of other Linkin Park songs. Like Heavy is a Crown is good, but it definitely feels like a different version of Faint, and definitely not as good as that song. Or the song Two-Faced, I think is pretty solid, although this one, you just can't help but think of One Step Closer when you hear it. I just don't think there's a whole lot of, unfortunately, major originality to this album. A lot of it just does feel like imitations of what Linkin Park has done in the past. Now, there are some exceptions to this. I think The Emptiness Machine, while it definitely does have Hunting Party vibes, does feel like something totally new. And I think it has one of the most interesting messages of the album, and Linkin Park admitting that what they're doing now is a bit hollow, and it will never be the same because of the tragic loss that has left a gaping hole in the band that will never really be filled. I also think Overflow is a pretty cool song for how experimental it is, although there are definitely some places where it doesn't work for me as much as I would like it to, and Casualty is a pretty good banger that I like with its more intense guitar work. But this album is definitely tainted by moments that just feel like imitations of Linkin Park that don't really work as much as I would want them to. Stained and IGY, in particular just do not work for me at all in terms of the overdramatic relationship content they're doing on there. And Over Each Other is just a really bad pop song that feels like a cheap B-side from One More Light, an already not great pop album. So, this album I feel very conflicted on, I have to admit. I think I'm going to probably check out what Linkin Park produces in the future to see if they can move forward, but I'll admit this doesn't leave me feeling as optimistic as I would like it to. 2.5 out of 5 stars for this one. Next up is one of my most anticipated albums of the year, Negative Spaces by Poppy. I am always so excited to see what Poppy does next because she is an artist who never stays in one place. She is always pushing herself to new directions and to do something completely interesting. On I Disagree, she had some more metalcore influences, which eventually transitioned into more alternative rock, to last year having more industrial and electronic influences, but now she is more back to doing straight up metalcore, along with some other influences that are incorporated on this album that I was not expecting. Jordan Fish of formerly Bring Me the Horizon fame produced this album, and you can tell his fingerprints are all over this album, but I think that is a good thing because it creates a very strong album that I think works very well from front to back. This album has a strong thematic arc anchoring it, and Poppy talking about the negative feelings inside of her that she has to deal with and that other people have to deal with. I think it's a very good album arc that works well from front to back. There are also just so many fun songs on here. They're All Around Us is probably my favorite on the album, with a vicious guitar riff that really works, and Poppy's uncompromising screams absolutely going off in the verses, along with a catchy chorus that is not going to be getting out of my head anytime soon. And then there's more Poppy, pun intended, moments like Crystallize that just has absolutely immaculate production on it with the synths that makes such a fun song that pops off the page just pretty much immediately. And there's even moments where Poppy captures some 2000s nostalgia, like on the song Vital, which really reminds me of Avril Lavigne in perhaps the best way possible. She also has a Deftones-inspired song on here in Surviving on Defiance, and I think the inspiration works well on this song. It creates a really cool atmosphere that is very unique for Poppy that I enjoyed quite a bit. And most fun, is seeing her bringing out the inspiration that she got from collaborating with Knocked Loose on the song The Sinner's Falling Out, which is an absolutely wild track that comes out of nowhere and sees her at her most vicious that she's ever been by herself, with a breakdown that will just get your head binging along right away. This is just a great album from front to back, like I said, with a lot of good thematic arcs appearing, and there aren't that many moments that I really dislike on here. I think that maybe Nothing is a little bit of a cliched metalcore cut, and Negative Spaces left me wanting a little bit more as it was the title track of the album, but overall, I did really enjoy this release and found it to be a very fun time. It continues to show that Poppy is one of the most interesting out there working right now in the metalcore and metalcore adjacent scene. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, we end off with the album Fimbulvinter by Brothers of Metal, another album that I was very excited for considering how much I really enjoyed Endless Saga back in 2020, and it has been a while since we've heard from them. And what we got out of here was another pretty fun power metal album, although not as good as Endless Saga, but still pretty good in its own right. It showed the band continuing to embrace their Viking metal aesthetic and creating songs that are just a delight and so much fun to listen to. Some of the biggest highlights on here include the openers Sawilo, Flight of the Ravens, The Other Son of Odin, or the really great epic closer Fimbulvinter, along with the beautiful ballad Nana's Fate. There's not much to say about this album because what you see is what you get. It's just a really good power metal album with fun guitar work, fun guitar solos, and great vocal performances from its two leads. I really feel like it's just an album to experience for yourself because you get a fun experience out of it. Nothing more, nothing less. 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. And with that, we end off this episode of Quick Album Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, then please leave a like on this video, and subscribe to my channel to see more content like that. But until then, I will see you on the next video.